passing over to
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Thank you, Lila, the voice in the background. So we thought before, like while your questions are trickling in, I think you can also ask them in the chat. We want to talk about one more thing that we didn't really pick up in the presentation and conversation before, the fact that developers can use the data, and there are tools for developers to use the data from the mobility reports. Janina, do you want to tell us more or give us a brief overview on what the options are?
Sure, absolutely. It's not so much the data directly, but the techniques that we use to process the data. So differential privacy that I mentioned in my talk. Differential privacy is the sort of thing that you probably don't want to implement yourself because it seems really simple, but it's quite tricky. And so we've had experts at Google working on this for a few years, and we have an open source C++ library with more implementations coming in the next month or so. And we also have, for example, something called TensorFlow privacy that allows you to train ML models in TensorFlow using differential privacy. So there are a few things out there. I know IBM, for example, has also released a Python version of differential privacy that you can, use to implement this.
Thank you. Lila, do we have the first questions?
Yes, we have a question from Mentimeter. So far, no questions in the deep dive here directly, but we have a question from Mentimeter. And the Google Mobility Report says explicitly this data set shouldn't be used for medical diagnostic, prognostics, or treatment purposes. So what can it be used for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that we did is we actually went to governments and public health authorities before launching these reports to check in with them what they would find useful and if this would be useful for them. And basically, the answer is that this is just one puzzle piece in a larger set of tools that we'll need to fight this epidemic. So the corona tracing apps are going to be one piece of that. The mobility reports, we hope, give some insights about how the social distancing guidelines are playing out in practice. And that's really the goal, is to help governments, give them access to large amounts of data to show them how those are playing out in practice.
Yeah, I guess to add to this, this is a kind of general lesson, not talking only about these reports, but talking about data which has been made available with differential privacy in general. You won't be able to use data published with differential privacy to make statements about individuals, like for treatment or diagnosis, because that's at the heart of how differential privacy works. To avoid that, you can do this.
We have another question from Mentimeter. What is actually shown in these reports? Does it show how many people were in a park or a supermarket, or how long they have been there, or a combination of all those data?
So it will show on a particular day how many people went to parks in a particular area. So let's say all parks in Bavaria, and we group those as parks, recreational areas. So all recreational areas in Bavaria, what's the percentage change compared to a baseline value? So let's say in January, it was like 10,000 people per day, and now it's just 5,000 people per day. So that will then show up as a percentage decrease, of course. So these are high-level statistics, of course. That's kind of the idea, right? To make sure that we're not using individual data, but we're gathering like large amounts of data and then showing these statistics about it. And it might be interesting to see this play out in different countries and different states as the social distancing guidelines now are also, of course, being loosened, to see how people's behavior is changing.
Yeah. When looking at the data, Janina, did you already find some interesting insights, things that surprised you?
Yeah, I think if you, I've looked in particular at the Germany data, for example, right? And it's pretty striking just how much of a decrease there is to things like transit stations, for example. So public transport is significantly down. Other areas like parks and recreation, I saw the line going much more like this. So that indicates that people, especially maybe when the weather is nice on the weekend, are still going out into parks, but still much lower than we saw before. So I think it's quite interesting to just look at that and also compare it with what you're observing in your own community to see those trends.
Yeah, and the key point about this, I guess. the key point is that it makes it to some extent objective. It's not just your gut feeling that it's less people here and there. It's quantifiable numbers. I mean, you can always argue about the statistical basis because not everyone is included and there might be a bias there, but it's much more objective than just what we think to observe, especially since we also change our own behavior.
We have more questions from Mentimeter, but I also want to restate that the participants here in the deep dive can also raise their hands if they want to ask questions directly. But the next question from Mentimeter: where do you see the difference between adding noise to data in order to add privacy and falsifying this data?
Yeah, it's again a really good question. Of course, there's a line somewhere, right? So the idea of differential privacy is how do you add enough noise that we protect the individual users, but we at the same time still have enough data that we can make statistical inferences from that. Which you maybe saw in the example that I had in my presentation. Of course, if you add more and more noise to the data, it just becomes it becomes less useful, or ultimately maybe even useless. One of the things that we did in these reports, for example, is we look very closely at how much data we have and whether the noise that we're adding to preserve privacy is actually too much. And if this falsifies the data too much, as you put it, then we actually won't publish statistics for that particular country or state or kind of place, like recreational area, etc. So we do look very closely at like what the noise is actually doing to the data and how much uncertainty and maybe mistakes it might be adding, and we cap that. And we would rather not give a number than give a number that is too far off. Björn, and maybe you have something interesting to add here as well from your perspective of as a researcher.
So actually, lifting this to the terminology level, I think the key difference is the intention of who does it. If you add noise to obscure the contribution of an individual to an aggregated data point, then you're not doing this in order to shift the data point in one particular direction, which is what would be your intention if you falsify the data. But adding to what Janina just said, I think it would make sense to quantify how much noise has been added to the data, and maybe that's something for future publications from the Google side to think about, whether they can not only say this is the data and we added sufficient noise to cover up the individual contributions, but also the amount of noise added was this and that much. So the distribution parameter.
Yeah. Do you know whether governments, because governments are also opening up data, right? Are they also using differential privacy, or do you have insights on how they're making sure that individuals are not identifiable in the data sets that they are publishing?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, public bodies releasing data are not yet using differential privacy, but rely on the more traditional way of saying, well, if I add data from this and that many people, then most likely this will not allow problematic conclusions about individuals. If you look at it very closely from an information theoretic side, from the angle from which differential privacy comes, then this is not always differentially private. It's more like there is a consensus that probably you can't do bad things with say, government statistics if they cover the population of an entire country, for instance.
One really interesting example. Sorry, I just wanted to add one really interesting example, not related to COVID-19, but more broadly speaking, where we've seen the use of differential privacy, is actually the US 2020 census. I believe for the first time in history is also going to use differential privacy, which I think is a really interesting use case.
Yeah, I just wanted to add before we look at the questions from the audience again. I know that governments say it, but they say that they take the approach that you just mentioned, Björn. But then the more data you have, the easier it will be to identify individuals eventually. So, yeah, I'm just wondering if.
on the other hand, with differential privacy, if you make more and more queries to the same data set and you haven't calibrated differential privacy to cover for all these future queries from the very beginning, you in a way run into similar problems.
Okay. Is there a lot of research on that, or do you think that there is a lack of research still when it comes to open data versus kind of privacy, data protection issues?
There is lots of research on that, but it seems we're hitting kind of fundamental boundaries there. If you don't know what is going to happen to your data in the future and which other sources of information are available, you can't cover all potential future problems. You can just make sure, as Google does with these mobility reports, that you decide in the beginning what exactly you are going to release about the data set and calibrate differential privacy to make sure that this doesn't end up with problems.
Great. Should we look at some more questions from the audience?
Yeah, we still have 2 minutes left for this Q&A, and I have a very nice, a very practical question. Is there a way to donate my data for research and health applications? Do you know of any?
I'm not aware of any at the moment, Björn. How about yourself?
I'm also not aware of anything at reasonable scale. Actually, we proposed something like this to the German Ministry of Education and Research half a year ago to set up an architecture for just that. Before Corona, we haven't yet got any evaluation results. I'm not yet sure whether there will be this project where we can set up something like this.
I think it's a really interesting concept, right? This idea of donating your data. I think that's really cool. So hopefully something will be there in the future.
Nice. So
Okay.
Since we're at the end now, like I just want to say thank you for participating. Also to the audience, we'll closely observe what's going to happen during the pandemic and our data and privacy. And I'm sure if you want to use the mobility report data, you can reach out to Janina or to some colleagues in Munich. Yeah, thank you for this discussion and to the next session. Lily, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, if you want to exchange further, you can go to the digital courtyard, our Hof, which you can find on our website. If we know that we have problems with the availability at the moment, but it's being worked on and it's getting better. And apart from that, we wish you a very nice, happy, good, continued program day at Republika TV. And on this channel, we start again at 2 with the deep dive session Danke Zivilgesellschaft, Masken nähen und Schutzschilder drucken with Anke Domscheit-Berg and Friedman Karik. Okay, and that was the timer you had in the background. Thanks a lot. Thanks to you, to Björn, Janina, and Julia. Very nice to have you, and see you soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you
Goodbye.
all.
Thanks, bye.